The allocation board had already made the joke twice before Callum Bryce walked into the room. He knew because the Vilori attendant at the door was still pressing her beak shut. The feathered crest along her skull flattened in what passed for stifled amusement among avians, and the two agronomists flanking the projection table hadn't bothered to wipe the expressions off their faces. They had long necks, the Vilori. Elegant, plumed, built for preening in more ways than one. The lead agronomist, Director Korath, stood nearly 2.5 meters tall, her plumage cycling through shades of iridescent teal, and she looked at Callum the way a sommelier might look at a man drinking wine from a canteen. "Plot 17, she said, tapping the holomap without preamble. A grid of agricultural zones hovered above the table, each one color-coded by soil classification. Most of the grid glowed in confident greens and blues. The square she tapped pulsed a dull, sickly amber. Saline substrate, high mineral contamination, effectively sterile by our classification index. Callum studied the projection. Plot 17 sat at the far western edge of Station Kivari's agricultural ring, buted up against the thermal exchange wall where condensation runoff from the cooling system pooled and drained. It was, by any reasonable assessment, the worst plot on the ring. "Fine," he said. Korath's crest lifted. The feathers along her jawline fanned outward surprise, or possibly insult at not getting a reaction. "You understand this is the lowest yield allocation on the station. The previous 3 cycles produced nothing usable from that plot. We decommissioned it 2 standard cycles ago. The substrate is effectively mineral concrete. You just recommissioned it for me. We allocated it to the human agricultural specialist because the coalition agreement requires us to provide one." She let the emphasis land exactly where she intended it. Plot 17 was available. Callum picked up the thin datapad she'd set at the edge of the table, his orientation packet, printed in Vilori script with a rough trade common translation underneath. "Soil analysis in here. Such as it is." He tucked the pad under his arm. "When's planting window open?" 6 rotations. Korath tilted her head, one amber eye fixing on him with the particular steadiness that avians used when they were trying to read a smaller creature. "You'll want to review our standard nutrient protocols first. The Vilori Agricultural Ministry's methodology has produced consistent yields across 400 stations for 11 centuries. I can assign a junior liaison to walk you through the basics." There it was, not cruelty, not hostility, just the polite, feathered certainty that he couldn't possibly know what he was doing. "I'll manage," Callum said and walked out. Behind him, through the closing door, he heard a sound like 2 wooden flutes being tapped together. Vilori laughter. The corridor outside the allocation office ran the length of the station's administrative deck, lit by overhead panels that cast everything in a cool, clinical blue. 2 Vilori maintenance officers stepped aside to let him pass, their crests flattening in the reflexive display of a species that treated smaller creatures as obstacles to root around rather than beings to engage with. One of them glanced at his boots, thick-soled work boots, leather, the kind of thing no one on this station had seen before, and made a small clicking sound in her throat that the translator didn't bother rendering. He found his quarters at the end of a residential spur. A small room with a sleeping platform designed for a body 50 centimeters longer than his, a sanitation alcove calibrated for feathers, and storage shelves too tall to reach without climbing. The coalition agreement provided accommodations. It did not specify accommodations that fit. Callum set his kit bag on the floor, opened it, and took inventory. Glass jars, 12 of them, nested inside each other, actual glass which the Vilori considered an antiquity on par with stone tools. Sealed culture vials wrapped in thermal insulation. 7 varieties of seed in labeled cloth pouches. A folding soil probe. A hand lens his grandfather had used. A steel water bottle. And a photograph, creased and sun-faded, of a wheat field outside Moore under a sky the color of hammered tin. He propped the photograph on the one shelf he could reach, drank some water, and went to sleep. Callum Bryce had grown up on a dryland wheat operation in northern New South Wales. The property sat on cracking clay that turned to concrete in summer and soup in winter. His grandfather had farmed it. His father had farmed it. Neither of them had ever been handed good soil in their lives, and both of them had fed people anyway. He had a degree in agricultural science from the University of New England, a decade of extension work across drought-ravaged stations in western Queensland, and 3 years with the UN's Soil Rehabilitation Program in the Sahel. When the Coalition's Cultural Exchange Program had asked for a human agricultural specialist to rotate through a Vylori orbital station, the shortlist had been short, not because there weren't qualified people, because most qualified people had heard how the Vylori treated human expertise. Callum hadn't cared. He spent the first 2 rotations doing nothing the Vylori considered productive. He walked plot 17 end to end, corner to corner, kneeling every few meters to press his soil probe into the substrate and draw out thin cores of layered mineral deposit. He held the cores up to the grow lights and studied them with his grandfather's hand lens, turning each one slowly, reading the layers the way another man might read pages. He collected samples in the glass jars, labeling each one with a grease pencil, another item that generated a footnote in someone's report, because grease pencils did not exist in Vylori material science, and the idea of marking a container with a waxy stick struck the station's supply officer as profoundly eccentric. He knelt in the dirt and pressed it between his fingers. He tasted it, which made the junior agronomist assigned to monitor him physically recoil, her crest going rigid with alarm. "That's the mineral content alone." "Salty," Callum said, "heavy on the sulfates, low calcium." He spat into his palm, rubbed the soil between his fingers again. "But there's organic matter down about 15 centimeters. Something lived here once." The junior agronomist, a slender Vylori named Tessic, had been assigned to him in what Callum understood was the avian equivalent of hazing duty. She was freshly credentialed, visibly uncomfortable around mammals, and kept a running log of his activities that she submitted to Director Quorath daily. The first 3 reports, Tessic later admitted, had been titled Human Specialist No Productive Activity Observed. "Our spectrometric analysis identified no viable substrate below the contamination layer," Tessic said carefully. "The mineral profile is incompatible with root development at any measurable depth. Your spectrometric analysis measures what your crops need. I'm looking at what mine need." Tessic's crest angled forward, the Vylori notation for skepticism. She made a note. She made a lot of notes. He spent the next rotation building things. Small things. A composting frame out of scrap thermal paneling he'd traded for with the station's maintenance crew 3 ration bars of earth chocolate, which turned out to be a currency the Vylori hadn't anticipated. The chief maintenance officer, a heavy-set Vylori named Gorak whose plumage was permanently streaked with hydraulic fluid, had held the chocolate between 2 talons, sniffed it, taken a tentative bite, and then handed over the thermal paneling without another word. 2 rotations later, Gorak appeared at plot 17 with a second piece of thermal paneling, set it down at the edge of the plot, and walked away without explanation. Callum found another ration bar of chocolate on his doorstep the following morning, returned unopened. "What is that substance?" Tessic had asked, watching the first transaction. "Chocolate. It is not in the station's nutritional database." "It's not nutrition, it's currency." He cut a series of shallow trenches into plot 17's surface in a pattern that looked, to Tessic's eyes, completely random. Branching lines that followed no grid, no formula, no logic she could map to the Vylori agricultural methodology she had studied for her entire professional career. "Those aren't aligned to the irrigation grid," she pointed out. No. The irrigation grid delivers nutrient solution on a 14-hour cycle calibrated to root zone depth, if your trenches aren't aligned. I'm not using the irrigation grid. Tessig's crest flattened. She made a note on her log. On the fourth rotation, word got around. Callum arrived at plot 17 to find a cluster of off-duty agronomists gathered along the observation gallery, railing above the agricultural ring. Their crests uniformly angled in the posture he'd come to recognize as polite curiosity layered over the expectation of entertainment. One of them, a stocky male named Drevas, silver-tipped plumage, senior rank, was holding a personal display that showed a live feed of Plot 17's embedded soil sensors. All readings were flat. All readings said nothing was happening. Drevas noticed Callum looking up. He tapped the screen twice, deliberately, showing the 0 readings to the agronomists beside him. The wooden flute laughter drifted down from the gallery like a wind chime in a place that had no wind. Callum waved up at them and got to work. He'd brought seeds, not the engineered cultivars the Villori used. Those were proprietary, gene-locked, and designed to perform in precisely calibrated conditions. He'd brought earth seeds, barley, sorghum, 3 varieties of bean, a cold, hardy mustard. And because he was from Moore and he couldn't help himself, dryland wheat. The Villori seeds were elegant. Each one came in a sealed capsule, pre-treated with growth catalysts, and planted by automated drone at precisely calculated depth and spacing. The drones moved across the green and blue plots in perfect formation, like synchronized swimmers, depositing futures into soil that had been engineered to receive them. Callum planted by hand, on his knees in the dirt, pressing each seed into the trench with his thumb and closing the soil over it. 4 straight hours. The gallery audience grew. Tessig told him later, with the careful diplomacy of someone who'd been taught to handle fragile species, that the consensus had been that he was performing some kind of cultural ritual. "They think it's religious," she said. "It's planting. They think those are the same thing for humans." Callum pushed another seed into the trench, pressed the soil closed, moved to the next mark. "Maybe they're not wrong. Director Quoreth has asked me to note that hand planting in uncharacterized substrate is not covered by the Coalition's occupational safety protocols. If you experience skin irritation from the mineral salts..." "My hands are fine. They are cracked. They've been cracked since I was 12. That's not damage, that's tenure." On the 5th rotation, Drevas came down from the gallery. He walked the perimeter of Plot 17 with his arms folded, his silver-tipped crest cycling through shades of skeptical bronze, and stopped at the edge of Callum's trench system. "These channels have no drainage coefficient," Drevas said. "The runoff from the thermal exchange wall carries a sulfate concentration of 14 parts per million. Without filtration, your substrate will become more contaminated, not less." Callum looked up from the trench he was cutting. "The sulfate concentration is the point. The point of contaminating your own plot. The point is that the organisms I'm introducing eat sulfates. They metabolize them, convert them to compounds the root systems can actually use. The runoff isn't contamination, it's feed." Drevas stared at him. The Villori face was hard to read at the best of times. The beak didn't move the way a mammalian mouth did. An expression lived almost entirely in the crest and the feathers along the jaw. But what Callum saw was the particular blankness of a specialist encountering a statement that was either nonsensical or paradigm-shifting, and not yet knowing which. "Organisms," Drevas said. "Bacteria, fungi, soil microbiome. I brought them with me. From Earth. From a sealed case in my kit bag, yes." Drevas looked at the trenches, at the composting frame, at the glass jars lined up along the edge of the plot, each one labeled in grease pencil with depth measurements and mineral notations. At Callum's hands, cracked and dirty to the wrists. The Villori Agricultural Ministry has produced consistent yields across 400 stations for 11 centuries, Drevas said. Without bacteria, without fungi, without, he gestured at the composting frame, whatever that is. Compost. Without compost, our methodology delivers precisely calibrated nutrition directly to the root zone. It is efficient, predictable, and proven. It is, Callum agreed, for the soil you already have. We have all the soil. Callum looked at plot 17, pale, crusted, decommissioned. Not all of it. Drevas's crest flattened. He turned and walked back to the gallery without another word, but he didn't pull out the display showing the 0 readings, and he didn't laugh. On the 6th rotation, a formal memo arrived on Callum's datapad from the Agricultural Ministry's Safety Division, requiring him to acknowledge that Plot 17's substrate had not been certified for unprotected dermal contact. The memo recommended standard-issue soil handling gauntlets. Callum acknowledged it, noted in the comments that he had been handling uncertified soil with bare hands for 27 years without incident, and filed the whole thing in a folder he labeled Soil Letters. On the 8th rotation, a second memo informed him that his composting frame had been classified as an unauthorized biological processing unit, requiring Form 17C for provisional approval. The form offered a drop-down menu of 47 pre-approved purposes for biological processing units. Callum submitted it with one amendment. Under Purpose of Unit, in the free text field, he wrote Making Dirt Better. Tessick told him the form had been forwarded to 3 departments before anyone could determine which one was responsible for it. "They're trying to classify what you're doing," she said. "I'm composting." "They don't have a form for composting." "Then they'll need to make one." On the 10th rotation, the food waste arrangement drew its own trouble. Callum had negotiated a waste diversion agreement with Porath, the mess hall coordinator, who was appalled that anyone wanted the scraps. "We process waste through the molecular recycler," Porath said, her crest tilting in confusion. "It breaks everything to base nutrients." "Why would you want it in its current state?" "Because the current state has microbes in it. Those are contaminants. On Earth, they're collaborators." Porath handed over the waste containers with the expression of someone giving a child a toy they'd asked for, knowing it would break. By the 11th rotation, a mess hall attendant had filed a contamination concern with the station's Environmental Safety Office. An inspector visited Plot 17, scanned the composting frame with a portable bioanalyzer, and found active microbial colonies not listed in the station's biological inventory. "These organisms are unlicensed," the inspector said, his crest rigid with bureaucratic concern. "They're bacteria," Callum said. "Unlicensed bacteria. Would you like me to fill out a form?" The inspector left with 7 jars of compost sealed in biohazard bags, and a promise that the matter would be reviewed by the station's Biological Containment Advisory Panel. 3 rotations later, the jars came back. The review committee determined that the bacteria were not pathogenic, not invasive, and not in violation of any existing regulation, because no existing regulation covered the intentional introduction of earth-origin decomposers into decommissioned agricultural substrate. The committee had, however, created a new regulation, 1 paragraph long, labeled the composting frame. He labeled it Callum's Dirt Kitchen. Tessick photographed the label, footnote 47. "Your footnotes are developing a narrative arc," Callum told her. "Documentation is not narrative." "Are you sure?" She was not sure. She made a note about being not sure. Footnote 48. By the 13th rotation, the composting frame was producing usable material dark, crumbling organic matter from food waste, cellulose scraps, and the microbial cultures Callum had brought from Earth. He worked the compost into his trenches with the flat-bladed shovel he'd fabricated from decommissioned hull plating, cerithium alloy. He'd ground the edge with a portable abrasive tool while the maintenance crew watched without comment, because the piece had been marked for recycling and technically belonged to no one. He'd turned structural-grade Starship hull into a garden shovel, and the only Velori who commented was Tessic, who added a footnote about it. "Your report yesterday had 11 footnotes," Callum said one morning, kneeling in the dirt. 12, I added one about the shovel." "What about the shovel?" "It's made from hull plating. I noted that the human agricultural specialist has repurposed structural-grade cerithium alloy as a manual soil displacement tool." She paused. "Director Quorath asked if you had done this because you lacked proper equipment." "I have proper equipment." He held up the shovel. "This." He could hear her feathers rustling, the involuntary sound Velori made when they were processing something that didn't fit their categories. That same evening, Callum was working late in Plot 17, adjusting a trench junction where two channels met at the wrong angle when he heard voices from the gallery. Not the usual audience. Two voices, speaking in formal Velori, low enough that the translator struggled to render it. He looked up. Quorath and Drevos were standing at the gallery railing, looking down at his plot. They didn't know he was there. He was kneeling behind the sorghum stalks, nearly invisible in the dim grow light of the station's night cycle. "The committee is discussing his assignment," Drevos said. "Oversight wants to know why we're allowing unauthorized biological agents on the ring." "Because the coalition agreement requires us to provide a plot," Quorath said. "The agreement requires a plot. It does not require tolerance of." Drevos hesitated. "Whatever he's doing." "He's composting. He's introducing uncatalogued organisms into a closed agricultural system. If those organisms migrate to the calibrated plots." "They won't. His plot is physically separated by the decommission barrier and 4 meters of inert substrate." "And if the committee disagrees?" Quorath was quiet for a moment. Callum could see her crest shifting in the dim light, feathers cycling through colors he couldn't read at this distance. When she spoke again, her voice was different. Not softer, more measured, the way someone speaks when they're considering a position they haven't fully committed to yet. "The committee can disagree," she said. "They can also wait until the harvest assessment. If his plot produces nothing, the matter resolves itself. If it produces something." "It won't produce something. The substrate is sterile." "The sensors say it's sterile." "Are you suggesting the sensors are wrong?" Another pause. "I'm suggesting that his methods are not measured by our sensors. That is not the same as saying his methods produce no results. It is saying we don't yet have the instrumentation to know." Drevos's crest flattened. "That is an unusual position for a director of the Agricultural Ministry." "It is an unusual season." They left. Callum stayed in the dirt for a long time after that, thinking about a conversation he wasn't supposed to have heard, and a director who was keeping a door open that her own institution wanted to close. On the 14th rotation, something happened that the sensors couldn't explain. The embedded soil monitors in Plot 17, the ones that had been reading flat zeros since Callum arrived, flickered, not with growth data, with moisture data. The trenches he'd cut were channeling condensation runoff from the thermal exchange wall into the substrate, and the microbial cultures in the compost were holding that moisture in place, creating pockets of hydration in soil the Velori had classified as permanently arid. Tessic noticed the flicker on her monitoring feed. She stared at it for a long time. "The sensors are registering moisture retention in decommissioned substrate," she said. "The microbes are holding the water," Callum said. He was kneeling in the plot, pollinating bean flowers with a soft brush he'd made from a strip of cleaning cloth wrapped around a stylus. The station didn't have pollinators. The Vilori had eliminated the need for pollination 3 centuries ago through direct genetic programming of their cultivars. Callum's crops were not genetically programmed. They needed help meeting each other. The microbes are holding the water, Tessic repeated, as if hearing it again might make it make more sense. That's what soil microbiomes do. They build structure. The fungi create networks, tiny highways between root systems. The bacteria aggregate particles. The whole thing starts holding water the way a sponge does, instead of shedding it the way mineral dust does. Our substrate is designed to shed water. The nutrient grid delivers moisture directly. That's efficient when the soil already works. It's useless when the soil is dead. Tessic made a note, footnote 63. She titled it, Moisture Anomaly Possible Microbial Retention Effect. On the 16th rotation, the station's cultural exchange officer, a small, fastidious Vilori named Pravik, whose plumage was the color of wet slate, and whose entire job consisted of ensuring that coalition exchange participants were adequately integrated, summoned Callum to his office for a wellness check. "How are you finding your accommodations?" Pravik asked, his crest politely neutral. "The bed's too long and the shelves are too high." Pravik made a note, "And your plot assignment?" "Plot 17, saline substrate previously decommissioned." "Yes, I'm aware of the assignment." Pravik tilted his head. "I'm also aware that you've submitted 3 forms to the Infrastructure Division, triggered a biological containment review, traded earth confectionery for construction materials, and fabricated agricultural tools from recycled hull plating." He consulted his datapad. "The mess hall coordinator has filed a formal complaint about the diversion of food waste to a non-approved processing unit. Callum's Dirt Kitchen." "I beg your pardon." "That's the name of the composting frame. It's on the label. The Biological Containment Committee required a label." Pravik stared at him for 4 full seconds. "Mr. Bryce, the purpose of the Cultural Exchange Program is to facilitate mutual understanding between coalition species. It is not intended to generate a regulatory burden equivalent to a minor infrastructure project. I'm growing wheat in decommissioned substrate with unlicensed bacteria using a shovel made from a spaceship." "When you put it like that, it sounds impressive." Pravik's crest cycled through 3 colors in rapid succession: exasperation, confusion, and something that might have been grudging amusement if Vilori allowed themselves grudging amusement in professional settings. He made a note on his pad, closed the file, and dismissed Callum with a wave of his taloned hand. Tessic was waiting in the corridor outside. "How did it go?" she asked. "He thinks I'm a regulatory burden equivalent to a minor infrastructure project." "That's actually quite a compliment, by exchange program standards." "Is it?" The previous human exchange participant was a linguist. She lasted 3 rotations before requesting reassignment to a different station. Her wellness file was 2 pages. Yours is 11. Pravik has never written an 11-page wellness file. "I'm flattered." "You should be. You've generated more administrative activity than any exchange participant in Station Kivari's history." She paused. "I checked." "That's either a footnote or a personal observation." Footnote 59. By the 18th rotation, something was happening beneath the surface of Plot 17 that even Callum hadn't fully anticipated. He discovered it when he pulled a bean plant to examine its root structure and found, clinging to the roots, a dense web of white mycelial threads that extended in every direction, not just around the bean plant's roots, but reaching toward the sorghum, the mustard, the wheat. The mycorrhizal fungi he'd introduced were building a network. Not just colonizing individual roots, connecting them. He'd seen this on Earth. Every regenerative farmer knew about mycorrhizal networks, the underground internet that let plants share nutrients, send chemical signals, even warn each other of threats. But he'd never seen it happen this fast. The Vilori substrate, stripped of all biological activity for centuries, was so hungry for life that the fungi were colonizing it at a rate that would have taken years in healthy earth soil. He knelt there for a long time, holding the root ball in his hands, watching the white threads pulse faintly in the grow light. The soil was building itself a nervous system. Tessic crouched beside him. She'd gotten better at crouching over the past 18 rotations. The first time she'd tried it, she'd nearly fallen over because Vilori legs weren't designed for that posture. Now she managed it with only a slight wobble. "What are those threads?" she asked. "Mycorrhizal networks, fungal highways. They connect the root systems of different plants and let them share resources. The beans are fixing nitrogen, and the fungi are distributing it to the wheat and the sorghum. The mustard is pulling moisture from the upper soil layers, and the fungi are sharing that moisture with the deeper-rooted plants. They're communicating. In a sense, through the substrate. Through the substrate." Tessic was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very carefully, "Our agricultural methodology does not account for interplant communication through substrate-based fungal networks." "No," Callum said. "It doesn't. Because we eliminated the substrate biology 11 centuries ago." "Yes." "Because someone decided it was more efficient." "Yes." "And was it?" "For a while." He set the root ball back into the soil, pressed it in gently with both hands, "until the soil you weren't using started to die, and then you classified it as sterile and decommissioned it and moved on to the soil that still worked." Tessic looked at plot 17, the dark soil, the climbing beans, the swaying wheat, the invisible network threading beneath all of it, connecting everything. "How many decommissioned plots are there across the Vilori agricultural network?" she asked. Callum looked at her. "You tell me." She pulled up a database query on her datapad. Her talons moved across the interface with a speed that suggested she'd been waiting to ask this question for longer than she was willing to admit. 41,612, she said, across 412 stations, classified as permanently non-viable, total area equivalent to, she ran a calculation, approximately 14% of the network's total agricultural capacity. 14%. 14% of all soil the Vilori Agricultural Bureau has ever managed is classified as dead and beyond recovery. Callum picked up his shovel. "It's not dead," he said. "It's just lonely." Tessic made a note. She titled it Scale Implications Preliminary. It was footnote 72. It would become the introduction to her report. By the 20th rotation, the beans had climbed the sorghum stalks and were flowering. The mustard had spread into dense ground cover, visibly retaining moisture in soil that had been cracking dry. The wheat, his dryland wheat, the same cultivar his grandfather had grown on cracking clay outside Moore, stood 30 centimeters tall and had begun to head. And the soil itself was different. Where Callum had worked compost and microbial cultures into the trenches, the substrate had darkened from pale mineral chalk to something that looked almost like earth. The surface crust the Vilori had classified as permanently saline had begun to fracture and break down. Bean roots pumping nitrogen, fungi building networks, bacteria processing sulfate, compounds that the Vilori's molecular recyclers had been stripping to sterility for 11 centuries. The embedded sensors still couldn't read the plants. They had no category for wheat, no profile for sorghum, no index entry for bean, but the moisture readings were climbing. The mineral composition data was shifting. Something was happening in plot 17 that the system could feel but couldn't name. On the 22nd rotation, Drevos visited the plot again. He stood at the edge and stared at the wheat for a long time. His silver-tipped crest was holding at a flat, neutral gray, the Vilori equivalent of cognitive dissonance. "The sensors show anomalous moisture retention in decommissioned substrate," he said. "The soil's waking up." Soil does not wake up. Yours doesn't. Drevos crouched an ungainly movement for a Vilori, whose legs were built for standing and walking, not bending, and pressed one taloned finger into the substrate. It sank. The soil gave beneath his touch the way that decommissioned mineral concrete absolutely should not have. He pulled his hand back and examined the dark residue on his talon, holding it up to the grow light and tilting it the way Callum had seen him tilt his datapad readouts when a number didn't match. He stood up without saying anything and walked away. Tessic added footnote 91. She titled it, Senior Agronomist Drevos, First Physical Contact with Rehabilitated Substrate. On the 23rd rotation, the mess hall situation escalated. Porath, the coordinator, appeared at the edge of plot 17 carrying a sealed container in each hand, and a look on her face that Callum had learned to interpret as conflicted hospitality. "I have a problem," Porath said. Callum straightened up from the trench he was working. "What kind of problem?" "A surplus problem. The molecular recycler processes food waste on a 24-hour cycle. Since you began diverting waste to your," she looked at the composting frame, "facility, the recycler has been running below capacity. This has generated an efficiency variance in my quarterly report. You're producing less recycled nutrient because I'm taking the waste." "Yes, and the supply officer has noticed. He wants to know why my recycler throughput has dropped by 6%. "What did you tell him?" Porath's crest tilted at an angle that suggested she had told the supply officer something that was technically true but strategically incomplete. "I told him we had implemented an experimental diversion protocol for research purposes. He accepted that. He also asked for the protocol documentation." "Is there protocol documentation?" "There is now. I wrote it last night. It is 3 pages long and references your Form 17C submission, the Biological Containment Committee's labeling regulation, and footnote 47 of Tessic's ongoing documentation project." She set the containers down at the edge of the plot. "I also included a provision for expanded waste diversion, should the research program continue beyond the current assessment period." Callum looked at the containers, then at Porath. The mess hall coordinator was not smiling. Vilori didn't smile the way humans did, but her crest was held at an angle he had never seen from her before. It was the angle of a person who had just done something slightly outside the lines of her job description and was deciding whether to be proud or alarmed about it. "You're covering for me," Callum said. "I am ensuring that the station's waste management protocols accurately reflect current operational practice." She paused. "The fact that current operational practice involves giving food scraps to a human who talks to dirt is incidental." She turned and walked back toward the mess hall. At the corridor junction, she stopped and said, without turning around, "The second container has grain husks from yesterday's processing run. The cellulose content is high. I thought your collaborators might find it useful." Tessic, who had been standing behind her datapad pretending not to listen, looked at Callum. "She called them collaborators," Tessic said. "She did. That's your word. You used it when she asked about the microbes. You said they were collaborators." "I remember." She remembered too. Tessic made a note, footnote 78. She titled it Lexical Adoption Mess Hall Coordinator. On the 25th rotation, the ministry sent a formal notice to Callum's datapad. Plot 17's first assessment results had been reviewed by the Regional Agricultural Oversight Committee, and the committee had voted to recommend that his plot assignment be terminated at the end of the current growing cycle. The notice cited persistent failure to meet minimum caloric density standards and introduction of unauthorized biological agents into station substrate. It recommended that Callum be reassigned to an observational role for the remainder of his exchange rotation. Tessic delivered the news with her crest held carefully neutral. "The committee has recommended termination of your plot assignment." Callum was kneeling in the dirt, turning compost into a new section of trench. He didn't stop working. Recommended, not ordered. The recommendation will be formalized at the next cycle review. 20 rotations. That's after harvest. Tessic paused. Yes, it is. Then I've got 20 rotations to change their minds. With what? He held up a handful of dark, crumbling compost, living soil, microbes already at work. With this. By the 27th rotation, the gallery audience had changed. The off-duty agronomists still came, but their crests were angled differently now. Less entertainment, more observation. Drevas still stood at the railing, but he no longer held up his display showing the 0 readings. Instead, he watched Callum work with an expression his feathers couldn't quite hide, the look of a man rechecking assumptions he'd held for his entire career. One afternoon, Gorak the maintenance chief appeared in the gallery. He stood apart from the agronomists, his hydraulic fluid-streaked plumage conspicuously industrial among their groomed feathers, and he watched Callum turn compost into a trench with the cerithium shovel. After 20 minutes, Gorak descended to the ring level, walked to the edge of plot 17, and set down a small package wrapped in maintenance cloth. More hull plating? Callum asked. Edge guard, cerithium offcut from a panel replacement on deck 9. Good piece, clean edge. Gorak looked at the shovel in Callum's hands, then at the dark soil, then at the wheat growing in the dead plot. His crest was held in the flat, practical posture of a maintenance officer assessing a job. Not agricultural assessment, mechanical assessment. The look of a man who understands building things from nothing, even if the material is dirt instead of metal. The chocolate was good, Gorak said. Then he turned and walked back to the gallery, rejoining the watchers, his oily plumage standing out like a stain among the pristine agronomists who had never once gotten their feathers dirty. Tessic added footnote 83. She titled it Material Contributions, Non-Agricultural Personnel. That title is too dry, Callum said. All my titles are dry. This one should be, The Maintenance Chief Brought a Gift. Tessic looked at her datapad, then at Callum. Then she changed the footnote title. It was the first time she had taken an editorial suggestion from the human agricultural specialist, and it would not be the last. On the 30th rotation, the first formal assessment was conducted. Director Quarath led her retinue through the agricultural ring. The green and blue plots performed as expected, every stalk within 2 millimeters of its projected height, every yield within 0.3% of projections. 400 stations, 11 centuries. Consistency was fact. They reached plot 17 last. Callum was sitting on an overturned crate, drinking water from his steel bottle. The plot looked, by Vilori standards, like a controlled explosion of vegetation. Irregular, overlapping clusters where beans climbed sorghum and mustard spread low beneath, shading the soil. The barley had come up thinner than he'd have liked. The sulfate content was still fighting him, but it was up. The wheat was up. Everything was up in a plot classified as sterile. Quarath stood at the edge and said nothing for a long time. Growth metrics are not available, Tessic reported. The embedded sensors are calibrated for Vilori cultivars. These plants don't register on the standard index. They're growing, Quarath said. Yes, Director. In plot 17. Yes, Director. The plot we decommissioned. Yes, Director. Quarath looked at Callum. He was sitting on his crate, drinking water, not looking at her. The human capacity for sitting and not performing while important people assessed their work was something the Vilori found quietly maddening. These are earth cultivars, Quarath said. Barley, sorghum, 3 beans, mustard, and wheat. Planted by hand. Yep. Without the nutrient grid. Didn't need it. Drevas leaned toward Quarath and said something in rapid Vilori. The translator caught fragments, irregular spacing, non-standard substrate modification, Unauthorized microbial introduction. Whatever the full sentence was, it made Quoreth's crest flat. The yield projection for this plot was 0, Quoreth said. Across 3 previous cycles it produced 0. Callum took a drink of water. Different crops, different approach. Our crops are engineered for optimal caloric density per unit of soil. Yours are. Alive, Callum said. He didn't mean it as a shot. He meant it literally. The Vilori cultivars were designed to perform. His crops were designed to survive. There was a difference, and it lived in the 15 centimeters between the surface and the dead layer below, where his bean roots were already fixing nitrogen into soil that hadn't seen a living microbe in years. Quoreth's retinue measured, photographed, left. Tessick lingered. Director Quoreth is not pleased. She's not supposed to be. The assessment report will note that your plot is below minimum caloric density standards. 1,200 kilocalories per square meter per cycle. It will be above that at harvest. Based on what? Based on the fact that the soil isn't finished yet. She studied him. Something moved behind her eyes that the translator couldn't render, and the crest couldn't display the first hairline fracture in certainty. I'll note that in my report. Footnote 106. He didn't change anything after the assessment. After the report, after the notation that plot 17 was below minimum standards and not recommended for continuation, he went back to his plot and kept working. He turned compost. He adjusted trenches. He pollinated flowers. He waited. The soil waited with him. By the 40th rotation, the waiting paid off. The wheat was shoulder-high human shoulder, which meant it rose past Callum's chest and stopped just below his chin. Golden heads heavy with grain, swaying when the ventilation cycled. The sorghum had reached nearly 2 meters, seed heads dark and dense. The beans had produced fat pods in clusters from vines that wrapped the sorghum like living scaffolding. The mustard had gone to seed across the entire ground layer, its root system breaking through the saline crust so thoroughly that the soil surface looked like a different substance, dark where it had been pale, soft where it had been crusted, alive where it had been dead. Quoreth brought her retinue for the second assessment. Same order through the ring. Same 0.3% tolerance on the green and blue plots. Same 400 stations, same 11 centuries. Then they reached plot 17. Quoreth stopped walking. The retinue stopped behind her. The only sound was the ventilation system and the faint rustle of Callum's wheat in the artificial breeze. This is not possible, Drevas said. His silver-tipped plumage had gone rigid, every feather locked. The saline layer was 4 centimeters deep. Our remediation protocols require chelation treatment and a minimum of 3 cycles of progressive desalination. Nothing penetrates the saline layer without chelation. The beans penetrated it, Tessick said quietly. She was standing apart from the retinue, her crest at an angle that meant pride warring with institutional loyalty. The root nodules produce nitrogen compounds that acidify the surrounding substrate. Over time, the acid front dissolves the saline crust from below. I documented the progression in footnotes 112 through 168. You know this how? Quoreth asked. Her voice was careful, not angry, careful, in the way that an intelligent person's voice becomes careful when they realize they may have been wrong about something fundamental. I've been documenting his process for 40 rotations, Director. I have 214 footnotes. Quoreth walked into the plot. She stepped between the rows with the precise, high-stepping gait of an avian navigating unfamiliar ground, her talons pressing into soil that gave beneath her weight. She reached the wheat, extended one long, taloned hand and closed her fingers around a seed head. She felt its weight. She held it for a long time. Caloric density, she asked, not turning around. Tessick consulted her pad. I ran a manual analysis using a portable spectrometer since the embedded system doesn't register earth cultivars. Rough estimate, 1,400 kilocalories per square meter. 1,200 was the standard, the minimum, the threshold below which a plot was classified as non-viable. 1,400, from soil the Vilori had given up on. "Run it again," Quorth said. Tessic ran it 3 times, recalibrating between each pass. The number moved between 1380 and 1420, above the line every time. Quorth released the wheat head. She turned to face Callum, who was sitting on his crate, drinking water, not looking at her. "You did this without the nutrient grid." "Correct." "Without engineered cultivars." "Correct." "Without soil remediation treatment." "The beans are the soil remediation treatment." Drevos made a sound, a sharp, clipped whistle the translator rendered as an expletive. First time Callum had heard a senior agronomist swear in front of a director. Quorth's crest was fully raised, feathers fanned wide, the involuntary display of an avian whose assessment had just been fundamentally recalibrated. The same reflex that made a raptor spread its feathers when it realized the creature it had been watching was not prey. "The coalition agreement allocated you this plot as a courtesy," she said. "I know. The expectation was that you would request reassignment within 5 rotations. I figured. Instead you composted food waste, planted seeds by hand, built a shovel out of hull plating, pollinated your crops with a cleaning cloth. It's a good shovel." A young agronomist at the back of the retinue made the wooden flute sound. Laughter. But it died before it finished, because Quorth's head snapped toward him with the speed of a raptor targeting movement, and his crest went flat against his skull. Nobody laughed. "Mr. Bryce," Quorth said, and the translator caught something in her voice it rendered as formal address, but which Callum understood was closer to the way a professional speaks to another professional for the first time. "The Agricultural Ministry will want to review your methodology. They can read Tessic's reports." 214 footnotes, Tessic confirmed. Callum paused, "and the committee recommendation to terminate my plot assignment." Quorth's beak opened and closed once. "I will suggest the committee defer its recommendation pending ministerial review." "Pending the harvest results." "Pending the harvest results." The harvest came 8 rotations later, and Callum harvested by hand. He cut the wheat with a curved blade he'd ground from another piece of hull plating. Cerithium alloy held an edge beautifully. He bundled sheaves, stood them upright to dry, pulled bean pods, shelled them into a canvas sack, stripped sorghum heads, and threshed them against the side of his crate, dark grain falling with a sound like rain on a tin roof. The observation gallery was full, not just agronomists, maintenance crew, mess hall staff, navigation officers with no plausible reason to be in the agricultural ring. Admiral Torish, the station commander, steel-gray plumage immaculate, who had never in his career set foot in the agricultural ring. He stood in the gallery with his talons gripping the railing and watched a human work with a blade and a sack. Below, in the green and blue plots, automated harvesting drones moved in formation, processing Vilori grain with mechanical precision. In plot 17, Callum carried his harvest in canvas sacks. Tessic helped him. She had started 3 rotations earlier, when the workload exceeded what one human could manage. She hadn't asked permission. She had simply appeared one morning with her crest held high and her datapad set aside and picked up a sack. "You don't have to do this," Callum had told her. 231 footnotes, Mr. Bryce. At some point, documentation becomes participation. They carried the harvest to the secondary testing lab, where Quorth and a delegation from the Vilori Central Agricultural Bureau were waiting. The Bureau had sent 4 senior analysts, Overseer Chellan, and 3 specialists, plumage groomed to a mirror sheen, datapads loaded with 11 centuries of yield data. The testing took 4 hours. Callum sat outside the lab on the floor, back against the corridor wall, hands dusty. A mess hall cook passed by, slowed, set a container of Vilori nutrient broth beside him without a word. It smelled like hot aluminum. He drank it anyway because someone had offered it and that mattered. When the lab doors opened, Quarith came out first. Behind her, Chelin and the analysts. Behind them, Tessic, carrying her datapad with both hands like a shield. Quarith stopped in front of Callum. 1,640 kilocalories per square meter, she said. The number landed, 1640, from sterile soil. From hand-planted seeds and a hull-plating shovel and food waste the mess hall had been throwing into a recycler. The protein content of your beans exceeds our standard ration supplement by 11%, Quarith continued. Her voice was flat in the way. A voice goes flat when emotion would be unprofessional, but neutrality requires effort. The wheat has a micronutrient profile our cultivars do not replicate. 3 essential trace minerals that our nutritional processing system supplements artificially are present in your grain naturally. She paused. The sorghum is irrelevant to our standard nutritional metrics because we do not have a category for it. It makes a good porridge, Callum said. I will take your word for it. She stood there, 2.5 meters of iridescent teal plumage, and 11 centuries of agricultural certainty, looking down at a man sitting on the floor with dirt on his hands. The Bureau has requested that your methodology be formally documented, not as an anomaly, as a case study. Tessic's been documenting it since day one. 231 footnotes, Tessic said. The Bureau has also requested an extension of your assignment, plots 15 and 16, adjacent to 17. Quarith's crest lowered slightly, the deliberate dip that among avians carried the weight of a formal concession. They are not sterile. They are classified as low yield. You're giving me better soil. We are giving you soil that we want to understand differently. And the committee recommendation to terminate my assignment. Withdrawn, Quarith said, this morning unanimously. Callum looked past her at Chelin, who stood with her arms folded and her pale plumage catching the corridor light. The overseer inclined her head, a small, deliberate movement that carried the institutional weight of a woman who could redirect policy across 400 stations with a single memo. I'll need more compost, Callum said. Quarith's beak opened and closed. Her crest feathers cycled through 2 colors Callum had never seen before, a deep amber and a quiet gold, then settled back to teal. I will speak with the mess hall coordinator, she said. The formal documentation session happened 2 rotations later in the primary conference chamber, a vaulted room with curving cerithium walls and soft overhead lighting. Callum stood at the front in his field clothes. He hadn't changed. Tessic had suggested it once, delicately. They're clean, he'd said. They have soil on the cuffs. That's not dirt, that's credibility. The room was full. Quarith's agronomists, Chelin's bureau analysts, station staff with no business in an agricultural briefing. Admiral Torish in the back row, steel-gray crest held at formal attention. Callum brought 3 things to the front. A glass jar of Plot 17's original soil, pale, chalky, dead. A glass jar of its current soil, dark, crumbling, alive. And a single stalk of dryland wheat, roots attached. A clump of rehabilitated soil clinging to the root mass with fine white threads of fungal mycelium visible throughout, and small nodules where bacteria had colonized. He held up the first jar. This is what you gave me, saline, sulfate heavy, your classification, sterile, set it down, held up the second. This is what I gave back, living soil, active microbiome, nitrogen-fixing bacteria, mycorrhizal networks, organic matter cycling through decomposition and renewal. Set it down. He held up the wheat stalk. This is how, not the wheat, the stuff attached to it. The network under the surface that you couldn't see because you weren't looking for it. Because your methodology doesn't use it. Because 11 centuries ago, someone decided the most efficient way to grow food was to deliver nutrients directly and skip the soil entirely. He set the wheat stalk on the table. Your system works. 400 stations, 11 centuries, consistent yields, impressive, but it works the way a machine works. You input nutrients, you output food. The soil is a container. You don't ask it to participate. He pointed at the dark jar. This soil participates. The beans fixed nitrogen. The fungi built networks. The bacteria broke down the saline crust. The mustard held the moisture. The sorghum gave the beans something to climb. They worked together. That's not engineering. That's ecology. He looked around the room. Rows of Vilori faces, some skeptical, some unsettled, some openly recalibrating. You asked me how I grew 1,600 kilocalories in soil you'd given up on. I didn't grow it. The soil grew it. I just introduced it to the right people. Silence. Admiral Torish made a sound, not the wooden flute laughter, something lower, something the translator rendered as acknowledgement of unexpected competence. His crest lifted once and settled. Chellan spoke from the side of the room. The Bureau manages production for 412 stations, 67 billion ration units per cycle. We do not adjust our methodology casually. I wouldn't expect you to. But Plot 17's results are not casual. The Bureau proposes a formal pilot program. 6 stations, 12 plots each, selected from our lowest yield classifications. Human-led methodology, Vilori documentation. The room rippled, crests lifted, feathers cycled. Drevos turned sharply toward Quorath, who met his gaze with a look that said she'd already known this was coming. You want to scale this, Callum said. We want to understand whether your results are replicable. They are. This isn't about me, it's about the soil. Then you won't object to teaching it. I'll need more shovels, he said. 3 months later, Tessic published her report, 412 pages, 90 pages of main text, 322 footnotes. The Bureau classified it as a Category 1 methodological study, the first new classification in the agricultural manual in 600 years. Callum didn't read it. He was in the dirt on Plot 16, which was performing even better than 17 because the soil hadn't been as far gone. His wheat was chest-high. His beans were producing a second flush. The sorghum was so tall he had to look up at it. Quorath visited every 7 rotations now. She came alone, walked the plots, asked real questions: root depth, microbial timing, why the mustard had to go in first. Because the mustard breaks the surface crust, Callum explained, pulling a weed. It's the advance party. Gets in, opens the soil, creates channels for water. Then the beans fix nitrogen. Then the grain goes in last, into soil that's been prepared by the ones who came before. A sequence, Quorath said. A conversation. Each crop tells the next one something. On the far side of the ring, a junior agronomist Callum didn't recognize was kneeling at the edge of Plot 12, a standard green classification plot with perfectly performing Vilori grain. She had her taloned hand flat against the soil surface, pressing it, testing it, in the exact gesture Callum had been using since his first day. Tessic followed his gaze. That's Mevrit, 3rd year. She read my preliminary report, asked me how to taste soil without damaging her beak lining. What did you tell her? To use her fingers first. And to start with Plot 17, because it's the most interesting dirt on the station. Callum went quiet. Something moved through his chest, the quiet kind of satisfaction that doesn't need anyone to notice it. Across the ring, Mevrit pressed her fingers deeper into the substrate and tilted her head, reading something the sensors couldn't see. Director Quorath, Callum said, not looking up from his weeding. Yes. The soil you gave me, Plot 17, the sterile one. Yes. It wasn't sterile, it was just waiting for someone to listen. He pulled a weed. Quoreth watched him. The ventilation system hummed. In the gallery above, 3 junior agronomists were taking notes for the pilot program Chelin had launched across 6 stations. They were learning to kneel. "Mr. Bryce," Quoreth said. "Ahem." "When the allocation board assigned you Plot 17, the expectation was that you would fail quietly, that the human agricultural specialist would produce nothing of value, and the coalition agreement would be satisfied by the gesture of inclusion alone." Callum pulled a weed. "I know. The board was not being cruel. We simply had no frame of reference for what you might accomplish. Our methodology is precise, replicable, and proven. Yours appeared primitive. I was going to say unstructured. Primitive is fine. My grandfather heard it plenty." Quoreth looked at the wheat, at the beans climbing the sorghum, at the dark, living soil that had been pale and dead 9 months ago, at the junior agronomist across the ring, kneeling in dirt that didn't need rehabilitating, but whose story she wanted to understand anyway. "The word I should have used," she said carefully, "is unfamiliar." She turned toward the main corridor. At the threshold, she paused. "Tesic's report is being distributed to all 412 stations this cycle. The Bureau titled it." She glanced back. "They wanted to call it Plot 17, a case study in rehabilitative agriculture. Tesic insisted on a different title." "What did she call it?" Quoreth's crest lifted once, the Velori equivalent of a smile. 231 footnotes. What the soil was trying to tell us. She left. Callum sat in the dirt for a while after that, the wheat swaying around him, the bean vines climbing, the mustard spreading quiet and low across the ground. Somewhere beneath his knees, 41,000 plots across 400 stations were waiting for someone to kneel down and introduce them to the right people. The soil under his hands was dark and cool and very much alive, and he thought about his grandfather, who had never been handed good soil in his life, and who had fed people anyway. He picked up his shovel's cerithium alloy, hull grade, held an edge beautifully, and went back to work.